Maybe just tell us something about how you grew up, what you studied, etc.
I grew up on a farm close to Waterfallboven in Mpumalanga, wonderful, happy years, with parents that were rather unconventional. My father, I'm one of 4 girls, my father taught us that we can be whatever we want to be. So it was only when I arrived at university that I discovered that women are second-class citizens in the country, and it came as a significant shock, but had given us a lot of confidence to dream and aspire. Then after school, or while I was at school, I was about 12 years old when we weren't regular churchgoers because I grew up as a Methodist. And the Methodist congregation at Waterfallboven, if we have 20 people there, in Afrikaans you would say, dis 'n geseënde opkomst. So we were obviously not enough children for a Sunday school, so I didn't sit in Sunday school. And then at the age of 12, just in a moment, God became real to me. I was at a CSV meeting at school, and God became real to me. And then I had this conviction that I want to spend the rest of my life serving God. Awesome. Now, that was way back in the 70s, and the way in which I figured out the very best way to serve God would be to fight against communism, because communism didn't recognize God. And the only way I could see myself fighting against communism is to go to the military. So after I matriculated at Belfast, I went to the Women's Army College at George for a year, became a firearms instructor. Nico's not here anymore, but by compliments of P.W. Botha and Sons, I wear hearing aids, so I support Nico's business. And was absolutely convinced that I'm serving God. And after I left the Women's Army College, I came to the University of Pretoria, just around the corner here. I was at Res, and still served at the Tuks military unit in those days. Earned my pocket money by doing military boards of inquiry. After I'm sure there are guys in the congregation, yeah. This is a church in the audience who would have been part of Ops Protea, Savannah, etc., where we did military boards of inquiry. And it was actually also in the military where I had my political Damascus Road experience, finding out that there are actually Christians fighting on the other side, finding out that there was such a big shot of ideology in all of this. And then at university, met my husband, that I'll just tell you a little bit about later. We were both student leaders in those days, and then did my articles, got admitted as an attorney. We spent a year living on the island of Taiwan in those days, trying to, it was the days of the sanctions, trying to get the technology for the nuclear power stations into the country, came back to South Africa, and recently, on the 21st of July, it was 21 years that I'd been admitted as an attorney.
Oh, awesome.
Sorry, 30 years that I was admitted as an attorney.
You've been married for 34 years, and you have 2 children. And I'm sure navigating the demands of building a professional career, and as you said, being a woman isn't necessarily a gateway for that, and also the demands of a young family. How did you manage to navigate that season?
Well, the huge advantage that I had is Dion, and I met one another as student leaders. So Dion had for as long as we know one another, been very, very supportive of me in leadership roles, given me lots and lots of space, which is really the single biggest advantage that I had. Then my mom-in-law, Dion's mom, she's now well into her 80s and has Alzheimer's. But in those days, she was my complete and total support system with my children. I want to tell something like to the women that are sitting here. I've been involved with the Christian lawyers internationally since 1993, so it meant that I traveled a lot and I was away a lot, and obviously the demands of practice. So when my children were at high school, I sat them down and I had this terrible guilt trip. And I asked them, I apologized and I repented of not being available for them. And both of them looked at me and said they didn't know what I was talking about. And my son said, Mom, had you not been involved, we would have never met all those interesting people. And my daughter said we would not have traveled all across the world. But the reality was I had a good support system, and I tried my very, very best to, when I was with my children, even though at times I had drivers fetching them from school, etc., to really be present with them and to really know where they are at. I complained for many years that we had to spend 35, 45 minutes there and another 35, 45 minutes back dropping them at school. But in retrospect, this was one of the most precious gifts that I have, spending that time with our children.
And they can't go anywhere, so you've got a captive audience.
I've got a captive audience, and something that we did, and if I was a bit late in doing it, they reminded me, but as soon as we left home, I asked prayer requests. And they would tell me what their prayer requests are, and we'll pray for their teachers and for their tests and for their friends and for their fears. So that was a way for me to know exactly how they start the day. And then similarly, the moms in the audience would know when you pick them up in the afternoon, those first 10 minutes are critical for you to know how their day was. So an answer like fine did not suffice. An answer like what did you do? Stuff, that was not good enough. My son sitting in the front row there, one day when he was at high school at St. Albans College, I asked him how your day was, and he said fine. And I said, what did you do? And he said, not much. And in Meldon Drive, I did a U-turn and I started driving back to St. Albans. And he said, what are you doing, Mommy? And I said, I'm going to speak to Mr. Hamilton. We're not paying this fortune for you not to do much at school. So that was the last time he gave me such a silly answer.
You have been a voice to the voiceless and a defender of the weak. But at the same time, the legal field is not necessarily known for its compassion or even its fairness. How much courage did it take for you to function in a legal system and in that kind of environment, but still be a voice for those who are defenseless?
Yeah, it's been a process. I would lie if I said it came easily or quickly. I had a wonderful mentor, Sam Erickson, an American guy who started off Advocates International way back in the early 90s after the wall came down in Eastern Europe. And they started assisting writing constitutions for the former communist countries who had also to ensure that religious freedom goes in there. And Sam taught me, he passed away in 2011, but one of the most important things that he taught me, he was an attorney himself, he said, practice as if you have got only one client, Jesus Christ. And it has been really the guideline for me. Will I charge Jesus if he asks me to do something? Will I give Jesus excellent service And it makes it easy. If Jesus is the client that asks me to defend somebody who cannot, or to act on behalf of somebody that cannot pay, I will have to answer one day if I said, well, I can't act on your behalf. But it takes a lot of courage because you have very many overheads. And you actually have to, in the very many religious freedom and public justice cases that we've done, recently the religion in schools case, right at the moment, the Dutch Reformed case that's going to court next week. We are acting on behalf of an alliance defending the autonomy of churches. The abortion case back in 1997, civil unions, there are so very many. Prostitution, the Dacha case, in very, very few of them we have ever received even a cent. So even the copy that you make is out of your own pocket. And I can say with complete conviction that God has always come back for us in other ways, even though we can. But it does take courage to say, I don't know how I'm going to pay the bills at the end of the month, but there's nobody else to stand in this gap.
So the voice doesn't always come with an invoice, does it?
Unfortunately not.
You made a statement that you can't just always go to the legal default, and there's a difference between legal and right. How did you?
If one thinks of as apartheid as it was legislated, all of apartheid structures were legal because that's what the law said, but it doesn't mean that it's right. So we can never use law as our default position about what is right. And then the other thing that I see more and more, it's a sharp-edged sword. Because on the one hand, at the moment in the country, we're relying very, very heavily on the courts that are, in a way, the custodian of our constitutional democracy. But on the other side, for instance, in family law, etc., we really do our best to keep matters out of court and to rather take a compassionate, reconciliatory route. So it's always a very careful balance.
I think it's so easy to think, okay, I'm doing this now for the Lord. Jesus is my customer, if you will, or my client. You're fighting for what you believe is, according to the word, the right thing to do. Does that mean you always win all your cases?
No, definitely not.
And how do you manage to get over the fact that you sometimes lose, but don't just que sera, go with the flow, I'm going to stop fighting?
Yeah, I think one needs to. I'm a very staunch believer that God is a God of processes and not a God of outcomes. And if we can learn to embrace God's process and not try and quit the process the whole time, then we experience the blessing. So even if one gets an adverse judgment, if you have, for instance, in that process managed to create an awareness with the church, or you have managed to reconcile a family, or you have managed to save the outcome of children's lives, then there has been value in the process. So I've learned that I cannot put all of my hope on the outcome of a case.
I want to go back for a moment to your first job. I think you said you were a candidate attorney and working for a boss who didn't necessarily embrace the idea of having a woman in his office.
Yeah.
Won't you tell us the
Carol,
funny story in court?
You must remember, when I was born in the early 60s, it wasn't legal yet for a woman to be in legal practice. It only became legal in 1963. So by the time I qualified and I went for my as an article clerk, there were very, very few women in the practice, and it was really a man's world. In fact, I was the 4th female conveyancer that got admitted in the Free State at the time. And even now, although our final year class, was just about the same number of men and women, I'm about the 5th most senior female attorney in the city. So it was really hostile territory in those days, and I had this boss. He's no longer alive, so I can tell this story. And other than the fact that his language was really peppered with all kinds of colourful seasoning, and he would tell me what I should do to get myself from point A to point B and go and serve a document. And one day, the firm specialised in patent work. So Exhibit A and Exhibit B were these massive, heavy clamps, iron clamps that go onto containers, that go onto the back of a big truck, that come off a ship, etc., etc. And we had these two exhibits. And they were at court. Our officers were at that time in Arcadia. And he always used to say to me, if you want to be in a man's world, act like a man. So at the end of the court day, he left these two big clamps with me. I'd gone to court with a municipal bus, and he said to me, get these back to the office. And I was standing, I could barely lift them, they were so heavy. And I phoned Mrs. Robertson at the office from the ticky box, as it went in those days, and cried on her shoulder, and she said, I'll send a driver. So then I decided, you will see, I will act like a man in a man's world if you want me to act like a man in a man's world. So about 2 weeks later, we had a pre-trial conference, and I was the only female in the chambers of the advocates, attorneys, etc., and they brought the tea in. And I could see everybody was expecting me to pour the tea, seeing that I'm there. And I just had a resolve, I will not pour that tea. So the end of the story is the tea got cold, nobody drank tea because I didn't pour the tea. And then shortly afterwards, a friend of mine, an American lady, said to me, you must be very careful of that attitude. She says, you know, when you get into a plane in America, the men would not even help you to put your hand luggage into the top. She says, it won't take anything of you. And I learned in those days that women have got very special gifts that men don't have in the legal field. They've got compassion, they've got understanding, they've got attention to detail. So I gladly pour the tea these days, and my younger colleagues don't believe me, but when I go with senior counsel to court, sometimes they carry my suitcase. So it was a learning curve, but very challenging in those days. In fact, instead of just doing articles for 2 years, I had to do for 3 years, because my articles were interrupted, and I couldn't find articles in the small little Free State town. Nobody was prepared to employ a female. And then even when I qualified, I found out that I was earning much less than the male attorneys, and resigned immediately. But it was extremely challenging in those days to be a female attorney.
What I love about Teresa's story is she learned to be herself, and I think it's a lesson to be learned by all of us. We have to be ourselves, but in the process also to be teachable, learning the lessons along the way, not just making a voice for myself. We have been saying facing challenges takes courage, facing discrimination takes courage. What are some of the failures or mistakes that you made? Teresa has a multiracial firm, and it mustn't have been easy kicking that off.
Yeah. Carol Ann, way back in 1997, actually 95, 96, I had really come to a place where I could no longer take the discrimination against me as a woman. I looked as I was seeking for parking as the young white men were just passing me by on our career paths. And in a very desperate, very heavily depressed state, one evening at church I asked for prayer. And then in the middle of the prayer, the guy that was praying with me said to me, God says to me, you must start a firm to His glory, but you must go back to your old firm and go and tell them why you leave. So I don't want to take too much time up with the detail, but in those days, black economic empowerment didn't exist. It wasn't yet a flavor of the day. But I had two black guys who were friends of mine who were experiencing similar discrimination from where they were. And I can remember I left the firm, and it was myself and my old secretary, Dina. She died a few years ago. And the other two of us sat, and I said, Dina, wow, look at this firm. To the glory of God, we don't have one client, we don't have one file. We're sitting at my house. But God said we must start a new firm. And as Nico said just now, don't despise small beginnings. Then in 1997, I joined Sibusiso Gamede and Selo Motla, and we started off one of South Africa's very, very first multiracial law firms, and also very, I cannot think of many others that still exist. Wonderful empowerment stories. Our empowerment was sincere because it had no financial gain for us in those days. So one of our beautiful empowerment stories is two of my children's nannies. Today, the one is our senior bookkeeper and the other is a senior secretary with a law firm. And we literally had to... And of course, in those days, everybody laughed at me. Everybody was trying to do empowerment for the financial gain that they were getting, but you don't get a lot of financial gain if you have to teach somebody that this is a checkbook, because their parents had earned wages. This is a checkbook. Let me show you how to complete the checkbook. This is a computer. You switch it on over here. So it took amazing courage, but my husband, on the very first day, on the 1st of September 1997, when we opened the firm, he gave me scripture from Joshua 1 verse 9, which says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged. The Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." And courage was, in other words, not for me a choice. It was a command. The only choice was I going to be obedient or not. In Joshua, there are many times saying, be strong and courageous, but this is the one verse in which it says, have I not commanded you?
Yeah. What I love about all the stories that Teresa told me is it wasn't making a way for herself. It was making a way for what God laid on her heart. And there's a huge difference. I never once picked up selfish ambition, but making a way for her and for other people alongside to do what God had laid on her heart. So our final story is just about 10 years ago, you found yourself exhausted and on the brink of burnout.
Yeah.
And something happened that turned that around. Yeah.
It was 2008, and you guys would remember that in the beginning of 2008, 2007, 2008, the National Credit Act came into being, so it immediately suppressed the whole of conveyancing and the home market and bonds, etc., etc. And shortly after that, in September, October 2008, the global recession started, and I found myself not having received a salary for 6 months. I found myself having to retrench 28 people who had become like sisters and mothers and children to me. And at the same time, in October 2008, I got elected as the first chairperson of the Global Council of Advocates International. And I was completely overwhelmed by responsibility, by worry, by just trying to work harder and harder, put in more hours and more hours. And during the time that I was in Washington in 2008, I was given a book as a gift by the author, Ruth Haley Barton, and the book's name is Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership. And she uses Moses, and her philosophy is, how on earth can we be leading if we are not strong in our own souls? You just run out of steam. And she then suggested a few things which turned my life upside down.
Yeah, we're just going to press the pause button here. The long and the short, she'll continue her story now, is that God laid on her heart to set aside a period of Sabbath every week. And obviously it comes at a cost, great cost, because if you earn money by the hour, every hour that you set aside for something else means it costs you something. And she came to a decision to make a day of Sabbath every single week, and she has been doing that for quite a while. And I wonder, is that something that you regularly do as a business person? Do you have a time to reset, reflect, realign, recover, restore? Or is it just 24/7, every single day, every single month of the year? And then if you're lucky enough, you can take a couple of weeks in December and you kind of just make it till then. And so we're going to go into a short discussion around the table. What would it take for you, if you do not currently have such a time, to actually be able to do something like that? And do you think it's sustainable? Do you think it's something that's possible, or is it impossible in your current situation? And what would be the benefits of doing it, but what would be the cost and the sacrifice that you would have to make to do that, and would it be worth it?